Whether you're outside or in your kitchen, it's always an adventure when you're blazing your own trail. And dinner tonight will be an adventure, just Rachel and me, home alone. Let me share a secret recipe. Discover an ingredient that fires your imagination. Choose other flavors to match. Find the best way to cook them.
Simple is best.
My secret recipe? Cooking without a recipe.
And you can do it too. You can do it too.
I love snowshoeing. The exercise, the rhythm, the scenery. It's inspiring. Today I'm inspired by, hey, winter. It's cold out and I'd like some heat. Now, Rachel's dropping Gabe off at his grandmother's so we can have a nice, quiet dinner together tonight. A rare treat. She'll be home pretty soon. I've got a beautiful beef blade steak, just the thing for a stew. What you can't see, though, is it's tough. Because in nature, the more an animal uses a muscle, the more texture develops in that muscle, and correspondingly, the more flavor. Now, I know since I'm stewing it that I'm going to have to brown it. That's always the first thing you do when you're making a stew. Now, I like to preheat my pot before I add the oil. Just warm that pot up a little bit. Of course, a little bit of salt and pepper as well. These days, there's so much focus on tender meat that the tender stuff is the most expensive. In fact, the tougher the meat, the cheaper. Which doesn't make sense to me because, hey, the tough stuff's got the most flavor. You'd think it would be the most expensive, too. There we go. And once that pan is warm, then add your oil. That way you don't burn the oil. In quick succession, a little bit of canola oil. And immediately get that meat in there. Start searing. There we go. Now there's one very important ingredient in stews that we can't forget, and it is patience. What I mean by that is you've got to take the time to brown the meat properly. This is the only point in the recipe where we're going to have the high temperature that it takes to brown meat. Because once we start adding all of the liquid to the stew, the temperature drops. You'd never brown a steak by dipping it in boiling water, of course. Now, have you ever had meat stick in the pan? It just won't turn over. It's actually trying to tell you something. It's saying, don't flip me over. I'm not ready yet. When it's ready, all the fibers of the meat actually constrict and release by pulling themselves away from the metal. Then you can flip it easily. Looking good. And I can smell that nice, deep, dark brown caramelizing flavor that's going to give my stew lots and lots of rich body. Now, what other flavors do I want in here? Of course, ginger. Nice and aromatic, tons of flavor to it, pungency. That's going to go really well with that beef. Now, what else? This is where I get my inspiration, right here in this pantry. Orange. There it is. I've got it. Orange ginger beef. That classic Szechuan flavor combination. Chinese cooking at its best. That's what I'll do. I'll braise the beef with orange juice. It'll work perfectly. Orange ginger beef. Now I've been thinking about a cup of hot cocoa ever since I hit that last hill on my snowshoes. Just a big splash of milk. And guess what? Cocoa powder's good for you. It's an antioxidant. Lots of cocoa powder. Heaping spoonful of brown sugar. And I balance out those flavors with some homemade vanilla extract. Look at that. It's just vanilla beans soaking in brandy. And the secret ingredient, cayenne pepper. Just the slightest little bit of this. It doesn't take very much. It's pretty spicy. Hey, I'm still looking for heat today. The beautiful thing about all that cayenne is that it'll just complement the actual temperature heat. It's like the two heats work very well together. The spicy heat, the temperature heat. Oh boy, does that smell good. Looks awesome. Now we're talking. Boy, that cayenne adds just the right boost there. Dinner's going together nicely. Still got to come up with a dessert idea, and I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to get all those ingredients in that pot. But you know, I'm not worried about it. I'm having fun in my kitchen. My goal is a steaming bowl of rich beef stew. I'm using a blade steak because it's got a ton of flavor. I'll accent the beef with the sharp, pungent heat of ginger, and I'll balance the ginger with the sweetness of orange. It's the classic flavor combination of orange, ginger, and beef. That blade steak browned up beautifully. You can see the flavor in it. And look at the flavor here too. This is really important. When you're browning in a pan, all those little bits down on the bottom, you've got to keep those. They're known as the fond, and they add a whole level of richness to the stew. It really doesn't matter what type of onion you use. There's so many different kinds, and any one of them is going to work just fine. And it also doesn't really matter how you cut the onion. Just chunk it up a bit. Another nice thing about adding all these aromatic vegetables is as they brown, they'll suck up all the flavors of the fond on the bottom of the pot. They'll sort of clean the pot in a sense. Now in French cooking, onion is a classic aromatic vegetable. In Asian cooking, ginger. I'm going to use a knob. There we go. Now because I'm braising the ginger today, I don't have to peel it and shred it. All you have to do is wash it and then simply slice it nice and thin. As soon as you start cutting it, you can smell it. I'm not really browning the ginger at this point. I'm just stirring it long enough to heat it through, to aromatize it. You'll know when you're done when you can smell ginger all over the house. And it's important to note that the garlic always goes in last. Garlic burns very, very quickly. You can't put it in at the beginning with all those onions. Just a couple of quick stirs. And now I need to get some spice into this. I know exactly the spice I need. Actually, the 5 spices I need. Chinese 5-spice. Classic spice blend. Here we go. Dominated by licorice flavors. Fennel seed, licorice flavor. Star anise, also a licorice flavor. Licorice root. Accented by ginger, it's already powdered. And of course, cinnamon. I use a lot of whole spices, and sometimes they go stale. The best way to get that staleness out of them is simply to toast them. You'll know when they're ready, when they're done, when you can smell them. Now, you don't have to go through all the trouble to make your own Chinese 5-spice because fact is, it's very commonly found in supermarkets. And now I'll simply grind these up. Beautiful. Just a little bit in there, maybe a teaspoon or so. I'll just store this in a tight glass jar for next time. Now at this point, we've got the aromatic flavor base of the stew all done. It's ready to move on. In fact, the only thing we have to add now is the beef. Just put her on back. And the liquids. You don't need lots and lots, just enough to cover. And I want to use about equal parts of orange juice and beef stock. There we go. You know, all these Asian flavors got me thinking. One of the hallmarks of Asian cooking is balance. The balance of sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I had a whack of navel oranges kicking around. I banged out a couple of jars of quick orange marmalade. I'm going to add some of this in. It's going to add a wonderful bitter flavor to this. A little bit of sweetness too, but most importantly, lots and lots of orange flavor. And best of all, it was super easy to make. Two large navel oranges washed in lots of cold water, quartered, tossed into the food processor with a cup of orange juice and 2 cups of sugar, processed into shreds and dumped into a saucepan and reduced for about 30 minutes. Then poured into a glass mason jar and stored in the refrigerator. All that marmalade's really going to kick up the orange flavor in this stew. Of course, I'm going to need some salt in here of some kind to round out all those flavors, to balance the sweetness and the bitterness. And with all these Asian flavors, there's only one candidate for that job: a couple tablespoons of soy sauce. Now, one of the most important things to remember when you're braising, any braise, any stew, you've got to have a tight-fitting lid. There we go. I got an idea. Pressure cooker. We need to speed this up a bit. I can do it in 20 minutes in a pressure cooker. Pressure cookers these days are awesome. I remember when I was a kid, my mom had one of these. I used to sit there on the stove with this little thing on top of it, jiggling away, making all this noise, and every couple of months it would blow up and you'd have to clean the ceiling for a week. Not anymore. Nope, they're high-tech now. Now they have an expandable gasket and the lid locks on tight. Nobody's going to get injured in this kitchen. Now what am I going to serve with this? And I still got to come up with a dessert too. The beef blade steak's under a lot of pressure. It's stewing away in the pressure cooker because Rachel's going to be home pretty soon. We're looking forward to a nice quiet dinner tonight, alone. Now I've added some more ingredients to the stew recipe. I added onions, garlic, and Chinese 5-spice to the stew. I boosted the orange flavor with a bit of marmalade, then covered up the works with beef stock and orange juice, and I balanced everything out with soy sauce. I'm not cooking from a recipe, I'm making it up as I go. Now to finish up this Asian-inspired beef stew, there's nothing like the world's most popular herb, cilantro. I'm just going to chop some of this up, and I'll add it in at the last moment. Cilantro is a very strong flavor, and it tends to dominate whatever you put it in. In this case, it's going to work really well because all of the other flavors here are also strong. That marmalade orange flavor and that Chinese 5-spice, they'll balance perfectly with the cilantro. Now normally with a beef stew, I'd serve a potato of some kind, but not with this beef stew. This is an Asian beef stew, and it calls for my old friend rice. Check out my rice stash. I think it's so cool how many different types of rices there are these days. Just a couple of weeks ago, I made this wonderful pilaf with plain old Carolina rice, a bit of curry, and some raisins. It was really good. But, you know, because I used it a few weeks ago, I don't want to use it now. I want to do something different. And that's the way I look at my ingredients. They're an opportunity to experiment, to get out of the box, to try something new, wherever you find them, whether they're here in the pantry, out in the garden, or down the road at the store. Check out all the rices. And here's one of my favorites, basmati. You know, the name basmati actually means the fragrant one. This is a rice that's grown in India and Pakistan, and they actually age it for a year before they cook it. The aging takes moisture out of the grains, and they taste better as a result. And because it's a rice, you don't need a recipe to experiment with it. All you really have to do is add water to it. All you have to do is remember 2 cups of liquid for every cup of rice. And the liquid can be anything. It can quite simply be chicken stock, beef stock, orange juice, plain water, or today, miso broth. And it's really got a strong salty flavor to it. I'm not going to use too much. And of course, if you don't have any miso paste, you could use another form of salt, like say soy sauce or just plain old salt, really. Just put a little tablespoon or so in there. Now I've got just the thing to jack the flavor of this rice. Lime leaves. They're a lot like bay leaves. They basically add a lot of aroma to it. In fact, if you can't find lime leaves, use bay leaves. 1 or 2 is enough. Stir them in. Oh man, you can smell them right away. And they're so fragrant. They've got a wonderful citrusy fragrance to them. But of course, because they're a leaf, they don't add the acid that goes along with the juice. Now to complete the rice, top it off with a tight-fitting lid. I've got it on a nice low heat. I'm just going to let it sit here for about 15 minutes or so. Then I'm going to turn the heat off and let it rest off the heat for another 15 minutes. And now for dessert. Rachel loves chocolate, and I've got a great idea for dessert. Bittersweet chocolate, my favorite. Now I like experimenting while I'm baking too, but you really have to pay attention to the basics while you're baking. For instance, you can't melt chocolate over a direct heat. You've got to insulate it somehow. And the best way to do that is by setting up a water bath. Small pot of water and a bowl sitting over the simmering water. That's the best way to melt the chocolate. What I'm going to make here is sort of a coffee flavored chocolate cake, but I've got a really cool way of presenting it. Now I need about 2 ounces of chocolate or so for this recipe. I'm going to need a half stick of butter or so. Now for this I'm using salted butter. Salt is just as important in dessert as it is in any other part of the meal. It helps bring out all the flavors that we're developing. I'm going to whip together the eggs with some sugar, just a couple of ounces. I'm going to just whisk this together. I'm also going to add some nice vanilla. Just a splash. Maybe a big splash. I really like vanilla. And vanilla, it's almost the salt of pastry because it really accents the flavors of the chocolate. It accents all the flavors in the dessert, brings them out. I'm also going to add a splash of coffee. Coffee goes wonderful with chocolate. And I don't have to add cream. Whisk that in. This is going to taste awesome. Got to make sure I leave lots of room for the whipped cream. The idea here, the batter's coffee flavored, and I'm baking it in a coffee cup. Now because there's raw eggs in this batter, I want to be super careful that I don't souffle them. In other words, if I put them straight into a hot oven, they're going to poof and rise up way too much. I'm going to insulate them in this same water bath. The oven's preheated to 300 degrees. By the time these set, Rachel and I will be ready for dessert. Hey there. We get the place to ourselves.
Yeah, it's
Have a
great.
glass of wine.
Thank you.
Are you hungry?
I sure am.
Cool. Let's finish this stew. Let's see how it turned out. Oh, man, that smells good. Look at that. It reduced down. The liquid's nice and thick. It's got its own built-in gravy. And you can just see how tender it is. The meat broke up nicely. It's ready to finish. And here's how I'm going to finish it. I've got a couple of green ingredients that I'm going to add dead last. Some cilantro that we chopped up. There it is. And I've got some green onions. Now you always add the green ingredients at the very, very end. That way they stay green, they still look good, but most importantly, they keep their flavor. Here we go. I'll just stir that in. Boy, this is looking good. Okay. Now here's how I'm going to plate. Actually, bowl. The rice turned out good. So I'm just going to put a little scoop of rice right there. Now I've got to get vegetables into this somehow. And there's actually quite a few ways to get vegetables into stew. But I want some crisp, fresh vegetables. I've got some nice, tender baby spinach. keeping to the theme, that Asian theme. Got some bean sprouts. And now I'll ladle the stew right over top of that. Oh, that looks so good. I can't wait to eat this. And it's a nice texture contrast here as well as a temperature contrast. Those nice cool vegetables with the hot stew ladled right over the top. It's a great way to eat. Isn't that beautiful? A nice, rich, steaming bowl of stew, comfort food for a cold winter day. All of my ideas flowed from that beef. Isn't it nice?
I'm sure.
I was rooting through the fridge and found this blade steak. And then I was in the pantry, stumbled on the ginger, and that got me thinking about orange. And next thing you know, the whole thing's Asian.
Oh, great.
So what do you think? Is this recipe a keeper?
Definitely. What's for dessert?
Oh, yeah, a little something for dessert, too.